So today I'm going to present a unique case of angle closure, and the point for here to us is that there are lots of medicines that we use randomly, and most of them are over-the-counter prescriptions. So some of them can cause angle closure in cases, and that should be kept in mind. The sequence of my presentation is as flashed. A young male presented to us in the outpatient department on the 31st of September, and he had complaints of generalized headache. And when he came to us, he had a history of sudden visual loss in both eyes as well. The headache was generalized, it was continuous, and occasionally associated with nausea and a bit of vomiting as well. And for the last 4 hours, he developed visual loss in both eyes that was sudden onset and diffuse. In the history, he gave us an important clue that he was using anti-allergic medication for 10 days. Apart from that, he was having no comorbids. His general physical and systemic examination was within normal limits. The visual acuity was down to hand movements and correctable to counting figures with minus 6 at 5.5 diopters. The other important thing was his intraocular pressures, which were more than 50 millimeters of mercury. The slit lamp examination showed conjunctival hyperemia. The anterior chamber was very shallow, and on gonioscopy there was complete iridocorneal contact and no structures were visible. The CDR was 0.5 in both eyes, along with mild disc hyperemia. His OCT examination of the optic nerve head and VEPs were carried out, which were normal. And then his visual field shows generalized, very mild changes in both of his visual fields. The lab investigations were within normal limits. He was immediately admitted and considered as an ocular emergency, given injection mannitol stat and then 250 ml twice a day, along with systemic acetazolamide and topical intraocular pressure lowering agents. And when the pressure settled to less than 30, he was applied YAG laser for peripheral iridotomy in multiple sessions so that the angle closure could be reversed. On the second day of admission, the vision with minus 6 and 5.5 improved to 6 by 36 and 624, and the intraocular pressure came down to 14 with complete medications and, of course, systemic acetazolamide. On further follow-up, 2 weeks, his vision was 6 by 6, whereas at presentation it was hand movements with minus 5 or diopters. So you can see here that the diopters were also decreasing and the intraocular pressures were within normal limits. So as you know, angle closure glaucoma is a serious condition. It can be either primary or secondary to various causes. The risk factors is obviously age, female, sex predominance, and family history. You see reduced visual acuity and narrow chambers. The initial management, as I discussed, include mannitol and other topical drops. The surgery permanent relief is through laser iridotomy or peripheral iridectomy. So to conclude, angle closure glaucoma is an acute emergency, and a quick assessment of risk factors and the mechanisms involved with a good history makes sure that a timely management can restore full vision. Here are a list of medicines that we randomly prescribe to the general population, and you can see here that this gentleman was taking loratadine for 2 weeks, and that medicine caused the angle closure glaucoma in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khizr. Acute angle closure glaucoma indeed is a medical emergency, and early diagnosis and prompt treatment is the key to success. I would like to invite Dr. Tanveer Chaudhary for a case report of thyrosis palpebra.
Number 3. Right. So वो कहते हैं कि जब आप पढ़ाने लगें तो एक भी बंदा सीख जाए आपसे तो you have achieved something और इस रूम को देखकर ऐसे ही लगता है कि that example fits it so well. Anyway, पढ़ाना नहीं है एक interesting case आया था which I actually saw for the first time, so I thought we will. I don't have any financial disclosures. So, thyrosis palpebrarum, rare eye infestation है, by thyrosis pubis. Mostly crab lice इसको कहा जाता है. Although their primary habitat is pubic hair, it can actually happen in any hair-bearing part, or even eyebrows and eyelashes. It may transfer from one hair-growing area to another hair-growing area as well. So, sexual contact and parent-child interaction most commonly transfer ये चीज करते हैं. But poor hygiene जो है and overcrowding has been recommended as a cause as well. Infestation most prevalent in sexually active patients from 15 to 45 years of age. And our study OBC age study 30 case report. So there was a 38-year-old male patient who presented in OPD tertiary care hospital with a complaint of irritation and heaviness in his left eyelids. He was known case. He was coming to me for a long period of time. वो interior से से आता था, and he was coming for corneal infection जो कि scarring में convert हो गई हुई थी और अब उसकी vascularization हम wait कर रहे थे, and he was a candidate for future corneal transplant. So he had also a couple of organ laser treatment for his for the blood vessels growing. He was hypertensive, but no other comorbidities. On examination, by the way, I want to say that this resembles so much blepharitis that my junior doctor missed it. तो हमारी एक आदत है कि जब हम देखते हैं हम उसमें लिखा होता है lots of dandruff among lashes. My junior doctor जिसने मुझे मेरे पास भेजा वो missed it completely. Vision in the right eye was 20/25 and the scarred corneal eye was counting finger. Right eye was quite. Left eye, when examined, the lashes and brows were inundated with lice and nets. They seemed to be moving around, and there were small petechial hemorrhages all along bleeding points, and his eyebrow was similarly affected on the same time. Not a very clear picture, but you can see a big lice here. Petechial points हैं यहाँ पर जो कि lashes के बीच में and बेटा ये वीडियो जरा ऑन करो.
ये वाइट सारे नेट्स हैं.
ये ऑल नेट्स हैं. इसके ऊपर जाओ.
Bilateral infestation.
So look, this is my view. This is my view of. Sorry?
Is it kept on the laptop? I mean, I can't.
Sir, right after breakfast.
Right after breakfast. देखिए ये बहुत जरूरी है कि आपने अगर एक्स्ट्रा खा लिया तो निकलना है.
Right after breakfast.
So they were actually holding the lashes. It was actually fascinating to see how they were holding the lashes to crawl along the entire length or knit से बही हुई थी.
Bilateral.
जी?
Bilateral.
Only one side. Only one side.
That is weird, not the only one side.
So yes, after coming out of the shock, all of us, and और ये fact है कि every person in the room started itching all over इसको देखकर. After we actually consulted dermatology department and we advised him मुझे तो समझ नहीं आया मैं करूँ क्या इसके साथ. मतलब मेरे तो इतने बाल घने हैं कि मैंने कहा मेरे बालों में पड़ गई ना तो फिर तो हो गया मेरा काम. लेकिन हुआ ऐसे नहीं. हमने डर्मेटोलॉजी डिपार्टमेंट से कंसल्ट किया और हमने इनको जो है मुझे उस वक्त यही समझ में आया कि एंटी लाइस शैम्पू जो है वो हम इनको स्क्रबिंग कराएं, एंटी इन्फ्लेमेटरी दे दें, there was a lot of swelling around, so anti-allergic drops did it. And we did that, and we said, obviously, Anna. But no, he came back.
Was it right eye or left eye?
Left hand.
The one which had the
Should have
corneal
been in
issues.
the right.
Yeah. Same. So we did ask him about his sort of कोई बुरी activities में तो नहीं involved because he is young and usually ये होता है bad sexual activities के साथ ही आते हैं और फिर indentate हो जाते हैं. And इसने कहा नहीं मुझे ऐसा कुछ नहीं है पता नहीं कैसे हुआ. Anyway, obviously they don't want to disclose whatever. So left lashes और brows जो है वो next time आया तो वो clean थी काफी. कुछ dead nits वहाँ पर मौजूद थी और वो हमने निकाल ली. Patient were advised कि future hygiene के बारे में. And this was the eye after treatment, just few of the nits here and there जो. तो patient with tyrosis palpebrarum came with palpebral pruritus के साथ conjunctival inflammation, lymphadenopathy, secondary infections हो जाती हैं. There are various ways of treatment. Mechanical removal with forceps, अगर बहुत कम है, trimming of lashes, fluorescein eye drops 20%, physostigmine 25%, yellow mercuric oxide and pilocarpine gel. Psoriasis also treated in some cases with argon laser and cryotherapy. So in conclusion, symptoms resembles blepharitis. So examine the eye. Whenever idea ये है, message ये है कि examine the eye. Don't just look for बहुत सारे look for cataract. Cataract तो नहीं है. Cataract तो नहीं है. हम लोग जाते हैं हमारी है examine the eye from outside inwards. तो पहले ये जो adnexa है ना, ये part of the eye है. This is all responsibility as well. So make sure that you examine the adnexa. Incidental finding होती हैं. मेरे पास अगर patient आता है left eye की problem से, I always examine the right eye first. फिर normal eye examine करें, देखें वहाँ तो कोई incidental finding नहीं. और दूसरा, if you know the normal, you can compare and you will get the pathology picked up easily. So mechanical removal is effective in some cases. Follow-up examination, residual lights where हमने निकाल लिए थे. It's important to have a good general health. It's important to give the hygiene, and it's mandatory to have hygiene. Hygiene के बारे में हमें तो बहुत साफ सुथरा होना चाहिए ना. हम तो 5 वक्त अगर नमाज पढ़ते हैं तो वुज़ू करें. Scrubbing of lashes रेगुलरली करें. और जब ब्लेफराइटिस के पेशेंट आते हैं मैं कहता हूँ जब भी आप वुज़ू करें आप स्क्रब जरूर करें एंड लैशेस को. So it was interesting case. These were references where you actually go and search and you said you are not the only one. People have seen this before. So yes, they can be very nasty all around, but we removed it and hopefully when you examine the patient next time, you will have a itch in your body as well. So one of the pictures I took in Turkey. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadir. Indeed, it was a rare case, and yes, many of us have never seen such a case in our careers. But let's hope we don't see such
Let's
cases
hope we
also.
don't.
So I would like to invite Dr. Najia Uzair now for pediatric epiretinal membrane presenting with neuro-ophthalmological manifestations.
The seagull भी देख लो लग रही थी
Yeah.
guys.
I'm Natia Uzair from the Department of Pediatric Ophthalmology at Shafa Trust Eye Hospital, Rawalpindi. Today I'll be discussing an interesting pediatric neuro-ophthalmology case. So this 7-year-old girl, she presented to our pediatric OPD with complaints of bilateral, gradually progressive, painless decreased vision in both her eyes, more in the left eye as compared to the right eye, for about 1.5 years. There were also complaints of noticing an outward deviation of the left eye for the last 1 year. Visual acuity unaided in the right eye was 620 and in the left eye it was counting fingers. So anterior segment examination of both the eyes was unremarkable and we could not carry out an orthoptic assessment at this visit because she had undergone cycloplegic refraction. So fundus examination of the left eye revealed an absent foveal reflex with a slightly elevated grey-white lesion with epiretinal membrane and surface shrinking. Here you can see the green reflectance on this multicolored OCT image indicative of an epiretinal membrane. Fundus findings of the right eye were similar, a similar looking macula with an absent foveal reflex and surface wrinkling, but the findings were much less pronounced than in the left eye. So we proceeded to carry out an OCT macular thickness of both eyes. OCT macula of the left eye revealed complete loss of the foveal contour with predominantly involving the inner retinal layers retinal thickening and an epiretinal membrane with vitreomacular traction. And the central foveal thickness was a whooping 710 microns. OCT macular findings of the right eye were similar but slightly less pronounced than in the left eye. We proceeded to carry out a fundus fluorescein angiography, but FFA in both eyes did not reveal any leakage. So now we wondered what these macular findings could be. We thought that they could be isolated epiretinal membranes, they could be combined hamartomas of the retina and the RPE, or it could be a case of uveitic chronic cystoid macular edema, but because there were no signs of intraocular inflammation on the examination or on the FFA, so we ruled that out. So we proceeded to carry out an orthoptic assessment when the patient followed up after 1 week. The right eye findings were unremarkable. The left eye showed a 30 degrees nasally displaced Hirschberg right reflex indicating an exotropia. The pupil in the left eye was fixed dilated. Now we had missed this finding in our first visit when the patient, on the patient's first visit because she had undergone cycloplegic refraction. There was no fixation of the left eye on covering the right eye, and prism covered test revealed a 50 to 60 diopter exotropia. There was obvious restricted adduction, depression and elevation in the left eye, and there was also subtle ptosis. So here you can see the extraocular movements. Note the left eye, there is no adduction, no elevation, no depression in the left eye. Gaze towards the left was absolutely normal. So the findings in the left eye were indicative of a left third nerve palsy. So we proceeded to carry out a complete cranial nerve examination of the patient, which revealed a drooped left angle of mouth indicative of a left facial nerve palsy, an upper motor neuron type subtle facial palsy. So we proceeded to refer the patient for an MRI brain and orbit with contrast, which revealed a right acoustic neuroma, as you can see here, which was extending into the internal auditory meatus and also compressing and encasing the right internal carotid artery and the right internal jugular vein. So we were dealing with a life-threatening pathology here. We proceeded to refer the patient for an ENT and a neurosurgical review. Audiometry findings revealed bilateral moderate conductive hearing loss, and neurosurgical review advised an urgent gamma knife radiosurgery for the right acoustic neuroma. But at this point in time, we were not sure of what was causing the findings on the left, because all the findings on the patient were on the left side. The left ptosis, the left third nerve palsy, the facial palsy. But this finding was incidental and it was on the right side and it was life-threatening as well. So we were not sure what the cause could be. So we proceeded to refer the patient to Dow Ojha Karachi for a gamma knife radiosurgery for her right acoustic neuroma. There she underwent an MRI with the gamma knife protocol, which revealed a right acoustic neuroma as expected and also a left cavernous sinus hemangioma. So this was the cause of the findings on the left. And she underwent a gamma knife stereotactic radiosurgery for this right acoustic schwannoma, the neuroma, and the left cavernous malformation. about 1 month ago from Rao Ocha.
That was not picked up on the MRI previously?
That was not picked up on the MRI previously. And before this MRI at Fauci Foundation, she had undergone another MRI at Karachi, and that did not even pick up the acoustic neuroma. So that was very weird and was carried out about 4 months ago. So I think an important thing is that we should also mention our findings and our suspicions when we are referring for radiology. So we mentioned our findings and we mentioned our clinical suspicion of what we were suspecting, which I'll just tell you what we were suspecting. So a little about gamma knife radiosurgery and its indications in ophthalmology. It is highly stereotactic radiotherapy, meaning it is precisely targeted and it avoids damage to surrounding structures. It is utilized in choroidal melanomas and iris melanomas where it is considered a globe salvaging procedure. Some of these eyes might be lost to enucleations. So this is a globe salvaging procedure. And it is also utilized in optic nerve sheath meningiomas and optic nerve gliomas where it is considered a vision saving procedure because operating on an optic nerve may mean loss of complete vision in that eye. So I've also heard of cases who are 6'9", optic nerve glioma cases which would otherwise have lost complete vision. Okay, so now putting together our findings. This right acoustic neuroma, the left cavernous sinus hemangioma, these neuro-ophthalmological manifestations, and these bilateral macular pathologies. So we think we're dealing with a case of neurofibromatosis type 2 here. So neurofibromatosis 2 is caused by a mutation in the NF2 gene on chromosome 22. It is a rare case being present in about 1 in 100,000 of the population. Usually it is autosomal dominant and there is a positive family history with those cases. But up to 50% of cases are sporadic, in which you do not find any positive family history, which was the case in our patient as well. Older diagnostic criteria were very stringent on the presence of bilateral acoustic neuromas for diagnosis, but newer researches indicate that even with a unilateral acoustic neuroma and a contralateral vascular malformation, you can go up to make a diagnosis of neurofibromatosis type 2. Genetic testing is also a part of the diagnostic criteria, but we did not carry out genetic testing in our patient. Ocular findings in neurofibromatosis can be varied. They can be cataracts, epiretinal membranes, combined hamartomas of the retina and RP. Ocular motor defects are seen in up to 10% of patients, which were there in our patient as well. Optic nerve sheath meningiomas and optic nerve gliomas are frequently associated. So our further management plan is that we plan to follow our patient for the development of further tumors, which seems inevitable considering the known course of neurofibromatosis type 2. And vitrectomy for epiretinal membranes is also in our plan. And we may contemplate squid surgery later in life for cosmetic purposes. Let's see. So, just
no cataracts in this child? Cataract nahi tha?
cataract yes.
Did you check corneal sensitivity?
Corneal sensations were intact. Yes, they were intact. We did.
फिर होती नहीं acoustic neuroma में.
जी.
First sign है ना?
जी, बिल्कुल हो सकता है.
Hearing was-
But maybe, I don't know, maybe we didn't pick it up, but we did.
But no plexiforms and nothing. And there was no
No,
macules, there was no iris.
It is not very necessary to find these when I looked up literature on it.
Any signs of NF1?
No, actually no signs of that.
Lesional lesions.
Lesional use no. And the literature reports that these are mainly more commonly seen in NF1. Maybe 1 or 2 lesions can be seen in NF2 as well. They are not as protean and as many as in NF1.
Or any family history of NF?
No family. That's what I said. That some cases may be sporadic, and our case was probably a sporadic case.
Did you check out the body for other, maybe a macule here or
Yes,
there?
not a very thorough examination, but yes, I did carry out. I did ask them, and I did carry out
Sometimes you get them at the back also.
at the back. So that is a possibility. I might have missed that. Yes. So just in this slide, मेरे हॉस्पिटल की क्लिनिक में जब जा रही होती हूँ तो वहाँ पे टर्निंग पे ये बोर्ड लगा हुआ था तो I thought it fits into our clinical practice कि amazing things do happen when we get involved with our patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Najia. Amazing things do happen. And thank you very much for sharing the case with us. Do we have Dr. Atar Tawseef with us? Right. So I would like to invite Dr. Mahmood Ali for his presentation on comparison of outcomes of first and second generation Cyclone G6 probe for micropulse diode laser.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
I'm Dr. Mahmood Ali, working in glaucoma services of Al-Shifa Trust Eye Hospital, Rawalpindi. So my presentation is on comparison of outcomes between first and second generation probes for micropulse transcatheter diode laser cycloablation. Next slide. Slide presentation. So there are no financial disclosures. We know that diode laser cycloablation is basically used when other modalities or other options for the management of glaucoma have already been consumed, and we do not expect uh, the trabeculectomy to survive long. So in those cases, we perform cycloablation. There are two modes for this diode laser cycloablation. One is the continuous mode, in which when we apply the laser, a continuous pulse is delivered. So this is a continuous mode diode laser cycloablation probe, and we also call it a G probe. We apply it firmly on the globe and then press the pedal, and then a continuous pulse is delivered. And what happens is that we are applying this laser in order to reduce the aqueous out production from the ciliary body. But there is also collateral damage, because when this continuous pulse is delivered, there is production of heat, and this heat accumulates in the surrounding tissues also. So in addition to achieving our goal of reducing the aqueous production, there is also some collateral damage in the other surrounding tissues like zonules of the lens and other parts of the ciliary body. So in order to achieve the goal and reduce the complication, the next micropulse version of our module of applying diode laser was introduced about a decade ago, and it is called micropulse diode laser cycloablation therapy. And what happens is that in this technique, the pulse of this micro diode laser is chopped down into smaller pulses, and when we press the pedal, there is a small brief period of time when the laser is on, then there is a gap, and then other micro pulse is delivered, then there is a gap. So in this way, there is no generation of heat within the targeted tissue and the surrounding tissues. So we achieve our target and the collateral damage is reduced. Okay. So initially, this first generation probe was introduced by the Iridex, and the problem with this probe was, in the continuous mode or G probe, we place the probe on the globe, we do not move it while applying. But in micropulse, it is not only the difference between the modes of the laser application, but there is also difference in how these lasers are applied. The micropulse, during application of this micropulse, we continuously move this probe from side to side about 90 seconds in the inferior hemisphere, and then later on 90 seconds for the superior. ये वीडियो प्ले हो ये दोनों एक वीडियो हम आपको शो कर देते हैं. This is the second generation probe, and you see we are continuously moving it from side to side. So इसमें हम एक जगह पे इसको फिक्स नहीं रखते probe को. While in the G probe, the previous version, we placed the probe on the globe and did not move it. Now, because we are moving it from side to side, we need a probe which is very smart, and there is no resistance from the lids or the adjacent tissues and from the conjunctival surface. The problem with the previous probe was it had a pointed notch on the bulbar side. So this was basically the fiber optic through which the laser is delivered. Now, when this probe was moved from side to side, the conjunctiva was also dragged with it, and there was chafing of conjunctiva. Conjunctiva became loose while we were applying the laser. So a lot of resistance was felt while the laser was applied. Also, this was a bit, the diameter was slightly large, as a result of which, during application of the laser, there was resistance from the speculum and lid also. Now you see the smarter version or the new generation probe, which is thin, and as a result of which there is a gap between the lid and the limbus, so we can easily move it. And this pointed fiber optic has also now been recessed, and there is no resistance from the conjunctival side. So the literature clearly shows that the micropulse is more effective and less damaging as compared to the continuous mode laser. But all the research in the literature has been performed, is reported with this probe. No literature is available which shows the efficacy of this newer version or the second generation micropulse diode laser. So next. So the objective of this study was to compare the pressure lowering effects of first versus second generation micropulse probe, and also to document the safety and compare the safety of first versus second generation micropulse probe over a 6-month period. The period is very small because this version or newer probe was introduced in 2020, but we know that due to COVID, last 2 years the number of patients that were treated were less, so we started performing this laser in the start of this year, and we the follow-up period of these patients is only 6 months. So we will later on share our results in the next study. So this is the study design setting where I work at Al Shifa Trust Eye Hospital, Rawalpindi, and all the patients with refractory glaucoma who underwent this procedure between January to March were included in the study. The laser settings were similar for both types of the probes, and the patients were examined on following day at 1 month, at 3 months, and 6 months. And success of this procedure was defined as an achievement of IOP post intervention IOP of between 6 to 18 millimeters of mercury, or 30% reduction from the baseline. So results, total 53 eyes were included in this study, out of which 29 were treated with the first generation probe and 24 with the second generation probe. Pre-operative IOP was almost similar between the two groups, 27 millimeters of mercury in the G group 1 and 29 millimeters of mercury. This was the mean average IOP of the two groups, and we can see it was almost similar. And post-operatively, we see this bar chart shows the percentage reduction in mean IOP between the two groups, and it is almost similar, no much difference. Slightly the results have improved with this newer probe, and we can see the this red line. This shows the results of the newer probe, while the blue line shows the results of the previous probe. And this chart shows the success rate between the two probes, and it is almost similar. Slightly better results with the success rate of the newer probe is slightly better as compared to the previous probe, but there is no significant difference. The success rate of this newer probe is 57%, and the previous probe was 52%. And the number of medicines that were used pre-operatively was also similar between the two groups, and the reduction in medicine is also similar. Well, the only difference that we noticed is the number of retreatments that were advised. What is retreatment? That if we perform laser procedure, we get the result, but the result is not as effective as we were expecting. So in order to improve the result, we sometimes retreat the patient, and in these cases there were more retreatments sessions were required for the previous probe as compared to the newer probe. The complication rate was also similar between the two groups. Only the subconjunctival hemorrhage, the incidence of the percentage of the eyes in which the subconjunctival hemorrhage occurred was more in the previous probe. And why this finding was noted? The explanation for this is the pointed edge of the previous probe, the fiber optic that was protruding from the probe, that actually in some patients who this pointed fiber optic that engage those vessels on the conjunctiva and those bleeded. So with recession of or the inward movement of that fiber optic in the newer design, that engagement between the fiber optic and the vessel is not there, and so there is less subconjunctival hemorrhage with the newer version. So the results of or and success rate was slightly less as compared to the previous published studies. And why this success rate was slightly less, I showed that it was around 60%. Some studies have shown results of up to 80%. Some, of course, difference in population, and also the laser energy that we use, that also affects the success rate. If we are using slightly moderate level of energy or less energy, the success rate will be slightly less, but the complication rate will also be less. If we use more energy for more time, then success rate will also improve, but complication will also increase. This slide actually shows the previous literature, and we can see that if the lower energy power settings are used, the success rate is of course slightly less. Here you can see with a use of 62 joules or 100 joules, the success rate was around 23%. Now this success rate was improved, reduction in IOP was almost 50% if the energy level was increased up to 200 joules or more. But the complication rate was also increased if the higher energy settings were used. So this is the actually review of literature, and the moderate level of energy that is safe and effective with lesser complication is between 112 joules and 150 joules. This was the energy level that we used in our study. So this is the last slide, conclusion. So there was a comparable drop in mean IOP between the two probes in our study. दोनों probes में कोई खास difference नहीं है, डिजाइन improve होने से जो ease है for the surgeon, definitely that has improved. There is no subconjunctival hemorrhage now. There is no resistance while we apply the laser. The results are almost comparable between the two probes, and there is gradual decline in the IOP lowering effect with the passage of time, and this is also documented in the previous literature also. So thank you very much. These were the references that were used for this presentation. If there is any question, we try to answer those queries or.
Dr. Mahmood, can you reduce the complications by applying the laser in sessions? For example, you apply the laser today and you do it after 3 or 4 weeks.
Yes, this is called retreatment. If that is what I was showing in the slide in the literature review. If you use higher energy settings and plan that we will do the laser only in one session, of course there are chances that you achieve more IOP lowering effect, but again complication rate will also increase. On the safer approach is you use moderate energy settings and tell the patient that with one energy session, with one treatment session, we expect around 30% drop in the intraocular pressure. So if a patient has an intraocular pressure of suppose 30 millimeters of mercury, we tell him that with one treatment session, we expect 30% drop or 35% drop, that is around 9 to 10 millimeters of mercury. So the IOP will be brought down to 20 or 21 millimeters of mercury, which is not the target IOP in most of the cases. We are targeting an IOP of below 15. So we tell them that another session might be required after 2 months or 6 weeks. And we counsel the patient before we book him for this procedure, and it is better to not to use higher energy setting at one session, and tell the patient that more treatment session will be required.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, would you be comfortable to perform this procedure in eyes with good visual acuity with a very point, well, an almost fully cupped disc? Like sometimes we come across patients who are only eyed, a trap has already been done, 0.9 CD ratio, IP not controlled with full topical medical treatment.
There are studies, thank you very
So
much. There are studies in literature in which this modality is being used as a primary modality. But of course, we still believe that the literature is not sufficient that we can generalize these results. Still, trabeculectomy is the gold standard procedure, and we reserve these patients, modality for those cases in which the damage is advanced, or if we see that trabeculectomy is not will not last for longer time.
Sir, and another thing, we will also borrow this probe from you for our pediatric glaucoma patients. Would that be all right at Al-Shifa?
Always welcome. But I will tell you later on.
Okay.
The timing of this probe is only for 90 minutes in one day,
Yes,
and
yes.
we cannot reuse this probe.
Thank
You
you.
have to
So
align all
we
the
have to
patients,
coordinate,
align a lot
yeah,
of patients in
yeah.
your plan. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood,
Thank
for a wonderful presentation. I think the question answers we should reserve for the end and give time to the other presenters. Dr. Mehtab Nikhil is here, and I would like to invite her to present on No End in Sight, a case of pencil injury to the eye. I would like to request the presenter to please stick to the allotted time. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Mahta Meghal, and this is the place where I work. No End in Sight is the story of a young boy who underwent through a cascade of events over a period of 3 years. So here I'm sharing the suffering of this 8-year boy who presented through eye emergency with complaint of trauma to left eye with left pencil. So we admitted this patient for primary repair under general anesthesia. On repositioning the iris, we observed corneal chunk was missing at 11 o'clock. So we decided to close this defect with a patch graft from remaining donor tissue that we used in PKP in our department. We followed this patient over a period of 6 months, and we removed the suture after 3 months. Overall, post-operative period was uneventful, and we discharged this patient after achieving excellent anatomical and functional improvement. So after 16 months, this patient presented again with complaint of decreased vision in left eye with a whitish spot at 11 o'clock. Complete ophthalmic examination was carried out. His vision in left eye was 636 with early white cystic lesion embedded in iris stroma. Anteriorly, it was touching the corneal endothelium and posteriorly displacing the crystalline lens and causing stigmatism. So, surgical excision and cloto was decided. Here I'm showing you a very brief video of this procedure. Separating we are using visco dissection to separate it from endothelium and from the iris bed, along with some mechanical separation. And we sent this tissue for histopathology. This is first post-operative day picture, and you can observe subconjunctival hemorrhage superior temporally. Cornea is clear, and there was insignificant inflammatory reaction in anterior chamber with no hyphema, and histopathological report revealed non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium with intact basement membrane and abundant keratin plates. So, diagnosis of epithelial implantation cyst was confirmed. This is a post-operative picture for after 2 weeks. We followed. We kept the patient on antibiotic and combination of antibiotic and steroid for 6 weeks, and we followed this patient over a period. And overall post-operative period was smooth and uneventful. As we all know, iris cyst can be primary and secondary, and it can be caused by trauma, trauma, surgery, or maybe secondary to pharmacological drugs. And among secondary iris cysts, three types have been described: Purge cyst, serous cyst, and cyst with epithelial growth, epithelial ingrowth. And among all three, Purge cysts are rare type, and reported incidence in literature is 0.06%. The treatment is very challenging, and different modalities have been described in literature. So anyhow, this is not end of our story. This patient later on, this patient underwent through a third procedure for cataract surgery with IOL implantation, and in April 2022, this patient presented again with complaint of decreased vision due to positive capsular opacification. So yet laser capsulotomy was done, and we after reassessment, his current visual acuity on last follow-up visit is 6.9 with -1 at 50 degrees, and there is no recurrence of iris cyst. So after achieving excellent functional and anatomical improvement, we discharge this patient from follow-up. So the take-home message is there is no end in sight to traumatic cases. Every case is different from the other. So be careful and go very smoothly and gently while dealing with traumatic cases, especially in pediatric age group who have very strong inflammatory reaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahtab. Yes, we should bear this all in mind while treating the traumatic cases. I would like to invite Dr. Sayyida Aisha for her presentation on efficacy of atropine 0.01% eye drops for myopia control in Pakistan.
Thank you so much. So I have named my presentation as Tackling the Myopia Epidemic because we need to see how it has gradually taken up the entire world with its claws. So by 2050, almost 50% of the world population may have myopia, 9.8% being high myopia. Sight-threatening sequelae of pathological myopia we all know are retinal detachment, macular degeneration, and glaucoma. So imagine the epidemiological and social burden. So myopia scheme, we all know that the myopic eye is larger in size, and they are also called nearsighted. This is also known as nearsightedness. Up to the age of 2 years, the globe is grows spherically in all directions. Post that, the elongation is predominantly absent. As the elongation is associated with thinning, the corona is clear at the posterior pole, retina and decrease in red RPE cells in the retroequatorial region, and the thickness of duct membrane, although is independent of it. Myopia usually progresses faster at younger ages, and for the onset, progression and stabilization vary widely, influenced by environmental factors, lifestyle, parental refractive history, and ethnicity. Before we move forward, is a very important terminology that you must be aware of, which is known as peripheral hyperopic defocus. So what happens is that when a patient has a convex lens, this convex lens, concave lens placed in front of the eye as in a spectacle or contact lens, the peripheral rays are refracted in such a way that they focus behind the retina. over here. This is called as peripheral hyperopic defocus. So what does this do? Hyperopic defocus can stimulate myopic progression, leading to increase in the axial length. Since the image is falling behind the retina, the eye would try to accommodate that image and just result in the elongation of the globe. Okay, so the retroequatorial region, presumably the area of the peripheral focus, is presumed to be the afferent limb of this entire cycle. There are various mediators, muscarinic antagonists being one of them. As far as the efferent limb is concerned, it has been hypothesized what would be the region which is actually stimulating the growth of the globe. Sclera is most likely not the region because we know that there is scleral thinning, but if there is scleral thinning, the choroid should have increased or widened in size, but instead the choroid is kind of compressed. Brooks membrane, on the other hand, could be the primary structure which is expanding posteriorly, compressing the choroid and distending the sclera secondarily. So for myopia control, various things are available. But at present, topical atropine has been demonstrated to have the strongest clinical effect on slowing the myopia progression. Various studies, just a very quick review. ATO1, which was a 2-year study with 1-year washout, convincing evidence for efficacy of high-dose atropine was seen, but myopia rebound, the washout here and ocular side effects were very prominent. So what they did was there was an ATOS2 study. Again, a 2-year study with 1-year washout, but instead, if they saw progression in patients, they again restarted the treatment for another 2 years. They compared the doses of 0.5, 0.1 and 0.01% of atropine, and overall progression was minimal at 0.1 atropine with minimal side effects. Corporate review reviewed that the atropine 0.01 has comparable efficacy to high doses of atropine with lower incidences of the adverse effects. So my study was to affect the efficacy of atropine 0.01 in our population. So 50 patients were recruited for a period of 1 year with a refraction of -1 to -6 and represented visuality of more than equal to 6/9 in both the eyes. Exclusion criteria were medical history or predisposing to severe myopia and of course concurrent ocular diseases. Cyclopedic refraction, best-knitted visual acuity, slit lamp examination, non-contact torometry were all done. Spherical equivalent was calculated by a sphere plus half the cylinder, as we all know. So all patients were prescribed topical atropine 0.01% dispensed by the same pharmacy to be used at bedtime. Follow-up was baseline, 6 months and 12 months. So how did we calculate the myopia progression? It was calculated by subtracting the spherical equivalent after 12-month period from that of baseline. So treated patients were considered either responders if by the end of 1 year the progression was less than 0.5 diopters, and non-responders if it was more than equal to 0.5. So by the end of our 1 year, we saw a -0.48 diopters increase in myopia. So we had 84% responders and 16% non-responders, which was similar to that. The responders was the progression rate was similar to that of the ATOM2 study. Another study reported a progression of 0.54. Progression despite treatment, that is the non-responders, was 16% in our study, which is also comparable with other studies. So this looks like a very huge, confusing, flow chart. But the basics is that if you start at atropine, check the refraction at 6 months. If there is progression, you continue with the same treatment and encourage more outdoor activity. Some have recommended that you increase the dose of atropine or use other treatment modalities like orthokeratology. Once you continued it for the period of 2 years, you can stop for 1 year and again assess whether there is an increase or not. If there is an increase, then you restart it, the atropine therapy, or continue the treatment to the end of adolescence. So inclusion, With the rapid prevalence of myopia in population, AAA seems to be an effective method to control progression rate with better tolerance and minimal rebound effect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aisha. Do we have Dr. Imran Khan over here? Please, sir, I would like to invite you. His topic of presentation is dispensing multiple doses of bevacizumab injection from single vial in a biosafety cabinet. I think it's
I think it's time to wake up.
I think
आपने इमरान खान का नाम लिया
you can release it.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Dr. Imran Khan Nazari, working as a consultant ophthalmologist at Helper Eye Hospital, Quetta. I am today presenting my teamwork on dispensing multiple doses of bevacizumab injection from a single vial in a biosafety cabinet. It is a cost-effective and safe procedure. So, what is biosafety cabinet? They are containment devices with HEPA filters. The primary purpose of this cabinet is to provide the laboratory personnel environmental and sample from the pathogenic microorganisms as aerosols might be found during the processing. This is the biosafety cabinet. We have three types of biosafety cabinets, and the one which we are using in Helper Eye Hospital, Quetta, is the type 2. In this type, the room air is entering in the chamber. These are the HEPA filters that are contaminating these contaminated air and is making environmental friendly and releasing into the room air. Cabinets are provided with HEPA factors that decontaminate the air moving out of the cabinet. The air inside the cabinet then takes the aerosol particles that may have been generated during the process and move it away from the operator towards the HEPA filters. The air moving out of the cabinet is thus sterilized and is made environmental friendly. These three types of cabinets are there. The first one is not product friendly. The second and third one are both personal, environmental and product friendly. The third one is the best one, as it is contained in a completely closed ventilated cabinet. These are pictures, type 1, 2 and 3 respectively. The objective of our study was to determine the efficacy and safety of dispensing multiple doses of bevacizumab from a single vial and in our biosafety cabinet at Helper Eye Hospital, Quetta. Safety and efficacy of the intravitreal injection bevacizumab in terms of no incidents, as we are intervening in the posterior segment, so most hazardous complication like endophthalmitis and the anterior one like pupil and corneal abscess. Ethical approval from the Institution Review Board was taken. The study design is cross-sectional case study carried out for a duration of 6 months at Helper Eye Hospital, Quetta. Inclusion criteria was the patients that had diabetic macular edema and macular edema secondary to central retinal vein occlusion, large retinal vein occlusion, hemiretinal retinal vein occlusion, wet LMD and vitreous hemorrhage. Exclusion criteria was those patients that were supposed to have concomitant surgical procedures like phaco and phacoemulsification and trauma were excluded, and those patients which had their intravitreal injection from the same center rather than bringing from the outside, they were also excluded from the study. And those patients who had other type of anti-VEGF rather than bevacizumab, they were also excluded from the study. And intravitreal injections of bevacizumab that are prepared from AQH or STMH, they were also excluded from the study. We have enrolled the 900 patients and injected in 1270 eyes in our study after complete ophthalmic examination in OPD. Our patients were called on 1 day before injection. After arranging them in a group of 70 patients were list, and they were registered in our injection Avastin cell. Consent form was filled, random blood sugar, BP and IP was checked, patient shifted to the operation theatre, then 5% pyridine and 0.5% propa in a local anesthetic was instilled in the antibiotic. Dose were also given. After 5 to 10 minutes, that patient was scrubbed again with 10% pyridine and the eyelashes and eyelid skin was then cleaned. You can please show you. This is the biosafety cabinet type 2 which we are using at Alcohol Hospital. This is the machine. They have just switched it on and we have ultraviolet light here in that biosafety cabinet. We use this light for at least 40 minutes. And after 40 minutes, we switch this light and we prepare the injection in the fluorescent light that is also present in that biosafety cabinet. 300 patients got bilateral Avastin, and as I told you, 900 patients were enrolled. 700 patients were having diabetic macular edema. 140 patients had wet AMD. 75 patients had vitreous hemorrhage. Central retinal artery vein occlusion patients included 150. Branch retinal vein were 200, and heavy retinal vein occlusion was only 5 patients. Now the outcome is very interesting. The effective and safety achieved in 569 patients. We have just received only one patient who reported with endophthalmitis. That was on the 7th day, rather in the first week. And we had subconjunctival hemorrhage in 71 eyes. IOP was reported in only 5 eyes, that was managed accordingly. There is no retinal detachment, hypopion yet reported. As I told you, only one patient had endophthalmitis and no systemic complication we have received yet. Conclusion of my study is dispensing multiple doses of intravenous bevacizumab is a safe and cost-effective procedure if it is dispensed in a biosafety cabinet. Thank you, and I am thankful to my Quetta injection Avastin cell team as well, who is sitting here, especially Dr. Afzal Muntakhir sir, who is guiding us, and our HOD Shams Baze sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imran. Dr. Irshad, is he here? Dr. Irshad Zain. So please, your presentation on phaco-capsulotomy in intumescent cataract. And to the presenters, I would like to inform that your shields and your certificates will be available in Zavier Hall. Please do collect them.
Thank you, sir.
Cataract Raja sir. Today we discuss the phaco-capsulotomy in intumescent cataract. The wordings are different, but the basic concept is the same. It has intumescent cataract has been defined in different ways by Dr. Netovi. Mentions it as an advanced cortical cataract. American Academy states that it is an advanced cataract that results from swelling and congestion of the lens due to degeneration of lens protein. And they have also referred to Dr. Agarwal in this definition, who states that older stage of cataract that progresses when the lens becomes swollen from the effect of degenerated lens proteins. And then friend of intumescent cataract, Argentinian flag sign, the white-blue pattern of the flag of Argentina. This term was coined by Dr. Daniel Mario. This name was given to the blue stain capsular tags on either side of the central white cataract when you stain it with trapezoidite. And if it goes uncontrolled and extends to posterior capsule, it may involve it may cause a tear vitreous disturbance and nucleus drop, systemic macular edema, etc. So how to avoid it? The most important, a well-constructed wound, soft eye, speculum should not be too tight. Some people prefer IV mannitol. Then well pressurized anterior chamber, preferably with a high molecular weight viscoelastic substance, and needle decompression. Some people they do it this needle decompression with some people use 30 gauge needle, some people use 27 gauge, depending on some people use 23 gauge needle. Some do it some do it with the syringe and some do it with the automated IFSCs. Then another way is to use a two-stage initial mini rhexis and soft lens aspiration, and then extension of the mini rhexis. Femto laser, a very useful tool, but of course its limitations are there. The Zepto and plasma blade capsulotomy, but the edges are not that elastic and it is said to be of lesser strength than the capsular axis. Then phaco-capsulotomy, which we are going to discuss now. So this was conducted in a 2 years regime because the patients who were due to COVID, they were not coming that much. So we studied 2 years, and the first group underwent 23 gauge macro-capsulotomy forceps. And then this lens metal was aspirated with a single cannula, and after that the mini rhexis was extended to the normal size, while group B underwent anterior capsule opening or puncturing the phaconeedle. And then in the same way, the scissor was opened with the 23 gauge microcapsule rhexis flap. The flap was held, and after the initial mini rhexis was extracted to the normal size. So I will go into here. Video will clip it. Initially, you have to keep the bevel down and just touch the anterior capsule with the phaconeedle, and then give a puff. After that, you don't have to come out of the anterior capsule. You have to be there, and you have to do a viscoelastic exchange with the irrigation, because that actually the concept is that this bottle height, the fluid coming from that, it will maintain the pressure in the anterior chamber. And then after that, you can do this extension with the 23 gauge capsular axis forceps, and then you can perform this the Simcoe cannula. You can wash it out, debulk the capsular bag, and then extend as per your requirement the capsular axis. So these are settings. Again, the bottle height is very important because you have to pressurize the anterior chamber. And 20, preferences are different, but I prefer 20% phaco power. And of course, aspiration and vacuum should not be that much. So we found that 4 patients from the mini rhexis, which was formed with the microcapsule forceps initially, they developed extension peripheral section, while 1 patient from the phaco-capsulotomy group developed extension. But all the 4 were 5 were retrieved with the little maneuver. So this is a very useful tool, and especially in these post-COVID days, cataracts are more now mature, harder, and inclusive cataracts are coming due to the backlog. So this phaco-capsulotomy is a very useful way of reducing the chances of Argentinian plaques. And these factors again, they are very important. Bottle height, wide bore inflow tubing of the phaco handpiece, and well maintained, of course, anterior chamber, which depends on the wound as well. So this phaco-capsulotomy is a very useful tool, and it manages the research very nicely. Every surgeon should have district in surgical laboratory. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Irshad, and this was our last presentation of the session. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending the session. And with this, we come to an end. If anyone has any question, please do ask. I think we're already running out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.